Greetings and good evening to one and all. On behalf of my team, AP Legal Chambers, and on my personal behalf, I welcome you all for the 16th webinar of the series. I am Anand Kumar. I am going to be your host and the moderator for today. We are happy to team up with Bharatiya Nyaya Shastra, founded by Arvind Kumar, an organization started by the final year law students for the benefit of law students. The title of today's webinar is 7 Things Indian Men Should Know Before Getting Married by our special speaker, Advocate Amish Agarwala, Central Government Counsel, Supreme Court of India. I welcome all our participants. Before going into the webinar, I would like to make a few things clear. Kindly mute your audios from your end, and if possible, kindly disable the videos too. The session is a completely moderated session, and once the presentation of our speaker gets over, opportunity will be given to all the participants to ask questions. You can drop your questions in the chat box, and if time permits, all your questions will be answered by our special speaker. So once the presentation gets over, APLC is APLC and the question answer session would follow. A short info about the organizers for the event. We are Team AP Legal Chambers, a new age law firm in Delhi NCR with a branch office in Chennai. We started this journey in 2017, and since then we are trying to provide the legal solution to the best of our abilities to our clients. APLC has been providing specialized services in the areas of domestic and international taxation, constitutional laws, IPR, energy laws, commercial advisory, arbitration, and corporate compliances. We started organizing these webinars out of our passion for law, and due to the tremendous response from the participants, we are hosting it on every Thursdays and Sundays. As always, once this presentation of our special speaker gets over, the APLC's APLC would follow. Ask the Popular Learned Counsel. We have prepared a few questions from our end, and we would be shooting it to our special speaker. I am sure it will be both informative as well as interesting. Today, the 26th July, is the Kargil Vijay Divas, the day to remember and celebrate the courage, valor, and determination of our Indian Army, who unwaveringly protected our motherland in 1999 Kargil War. Their sacrifices and services continue to inspire each and every one of the Indians, generation after generations. A royal salute to them. Bollywood may have a superstar, Kollywood may have a superstar. Likewise, Tollywood, Mollywood, and each state film industry may have a superstar. But undoubtedly, the one and only superstar and the superhero of each and every Indian youth shall be Bharat Ratna, Dr. APJ Abdul Kalam sir. Tomorrow, the 27th July, is the 5th death anniversary of Kalam sir. He shall always be there to guide us and bless us from above. As a mark of respect, we dedicate this particular webinar to the Kargil heroes and Dr. APJ Abdul Kalam sir. Coming to this topic, 7 things Indian men should know before getting married. This is covered from the perspective of a man. What are the legal challenges and hurdles a man faces before, during, or after he enters a matrimonial wedlock? We do not invite any controversies, but healthy discussions are always welcome. So, let me introduce the special speaker of today, Advocate Amish Agarwala. Mr. Amish is one of the most sought after young advocates in Delhi NCR. He is the Central Government Counsel in the Honorable Supreme Court of India. He also regularly presents his matters in all the high courts, district courts, and tribunals. He has authored a book titled 7 Things Indian Men Should Know Before Getting Married, Stories of the False Cases and Legal Battles in India. He also maintains a YouTube channel, Amish Agarwala, where he has to his credit more than 75 videos covering basic laws for common people in simple English and Hindi. We are very grateful to have Mr. Amish on board. So as mentioned earlier, this presentation covers mostly the stories of false cases and legal battles in India from the perspective of a man. So, with this brief introduction, I welcome our special speaker, Mr. Amish, to take over this webinar and present his views. We wholeheartedly welcome you, and over to you, sir. Thank you.
It's an honor to be over here, Anand bhai, and thank you for your valuable time from your weekend time to recharge, and you've actually showed up over here. I'm very grateful for that. And Anand bhai, I am again very grateful for the opportunity to come over here and to talk about something which is something that I deal with on almost a daily basis, and this is quite an honor for me. I've seen the kind of people who have come here before me. I'm not sure whether I'm worthy to share the same space as them, but I will definitely give it my best shot. I know the name of my book was a little controversial. I chose it like that because that is precisely what a little catchy title is what I was hoping for. But after thinking a lot about what the title should be, I could make it an academic based matrimonial laws in India, or I could title it something like uh, you know marriage and divorce laws, something that everyone does all the time. But the reason why I chose the title of the name of the book, which Anand Bhai was gracious enough to even keep here as the title of the webinar, is seven things that men should know before they get married. Now, of course, the seven things are not seven different laws, but different chapters that I thought that kind of cover the entire situation from a man's perspective. And that is the reason why I chose the number of things that a man should know before getting married after I wrote all the chapters. It was only at the end of it that I decided, okay, this is the seven things that a man should know before he gets married in India. And there were some people who were concerned, who voiced their concern and said, why do you have a webinar only for men and the things that men should know before getting married and not women? Well, one thing is that according to so what I would want it to be, even for my book, I did not want it to be an academic pursuit. I did not want it to be a textbook where someone reads and they understand about the laws of the country, because there is plenty of material which is already there on the internet, in the textbooks and everywhere else. What I have tried to pen down is in fact something which I did not put any footnotes in. I did not make any references to any judgments, latest judgments or anything like that, except maybe the most crucial ones in the book. And the reason why I'm talking about all of this is so that you can kind of have a background as to why I chose this title and what are these things that I am going to talk about in this webinar. The reason why I came up with this title, this book, and why we are even having this kind of a conversation right now is that there have been a lot of people who come to me after their marriage when they have gotten into a dispute with their wives or even their girlfriends or fiancés for that matter. And I've had these conversations with friends of mine. And whenever I sit down to explain to them the various laws regarding matrimony, relationships between men and women, I see that a lot of men are taken by surprise. They have no idea about what's going on. Everyone kind of has a vague idea about what kind of laws there are when it comes to protection of women, but nobody understands that what happens when those laws are misused by a few people. And I believe it's the same situation everywhere. Whenever you have a legislation for the benefit of one party or one section of society, it will always have a certain impact on another section of society. And we have countless examples, and they're quite obvious ones. Whenever you have a certain legislation which says that a relationship or the equation between certain individuals will be governed or will be mandated by law to go in a certain direction, then there is another faction which is going to at least that faction should know about what is going on over here, because otherwise they might suffer the consequences if they get into a situation. I'll kind of get into it. I'll try to explain what I'm talking about. The reason why I wrote this book again was because whenever I would have these conversations, these people would literally jaws would drop at the kind of situation that there is in the country. And because of that, I thought, every time I get into an hour long lecture about what all is there, I might as well write a book. And today is also the same thing. If people who are not really into reading books, or maybe want a different kind of a format, um, this is for those people in India. And one more thing that I wanted to mention was that the reason why we have this webinar only for men is because I feel that there have been a lot of conversations I have seen in the past few months of the lockdown and everyone being home that have occurred around, what is there, what is the law protecting women, how women are being victimized, and what are the remedies that a woman can have if she is a victim. And I get that, and that is very, very important. The rights of women and the movement that has picked up pace is very, very crucial, remembering the history of how women have been treated across centuries in this country. And that is why whenever I have several clients who are husbands or former fiancés or former boyfriends who come and complain about the so-called draconian laws that are there, which favor women and which are against men. And I have to explain to them every time, and it's almost an argument, a verbal fight every time with these people, when I have to explain to them that every single one of these laws which exists for the protection of women, they exist for a very good reason. There are several laws which have been passed over the past, say, 50-60 years, and each one of them is important. There have been amendments in the Hindu Succession Act, there have been the Domestic Violence Act, there have been various amendments in the law of evidence, the CRPC, the IPC. Of course, everyone knows about nowadays, everyone, especially the youth, knows about the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 2013, where certain offenses were made graver, and there were certain amendments made to the Evidence Act, the CRPC. All of those things were done. A lot of people don't know about amendments which were done in the law at the time of the Mathura rape case, and the need for that. In fact, if anybody wants to kind of go into a little bit of history, they can look up the Mathura rape case and what that was all about, and the kind of movement that created these changes. Having said that, the laws which are there for the protection of women are misused from time to time by women. A great example that comes to my mind, just to start out things with, is this one situation where a couple of years ago, maybe around 5 or 6 years ago, a friend of mine introduced me to a lady who had a legal query. So she called me up and she said that she was in a relationship with a man for several years, and the man one day just packed up his stuff and left her without informing her, because apparently the relationship was getting too serious for him. She told me that she was very upset by him leaving without telling her. She felt abandoned, and that is why she filed a rape case against that man. She went to the police and said that this man said that he will marry me, and because of that I agreed to have sexual intercourse with him, and he also forced sexual intercourse on me, and then he left, and then he broke on his, and he went away, and now I know that he never intended to marry me. This woman confessed to me that this was actually a false rape case, because he never forced himself on her, and neither was there ever any promise to marriage, or at least an inducement to marriage on the basis of which there was sexual intercourse. Now, this woman asked me this question: can I, once the truth comes out, if the truth comes out, and when the truth comes out, will I go to jail for filing a false rape case? And I, being a lawyer, having sworn, and there being an implied understanding that I will be there to uphold the law, I had to advise to that so-called client right there that there is nothing that can happen to her because of the way the laws of this country are structured. And of course, there is that whole debate that if you have stringent punishment for women, if they are accused, if they if the man is acquitted, then the argument that if a woman is prosecuted upon an acquittal, then that will discourage actual rape survivors from actually coming forward and reporting the crime, because they will think that one, I've already suffered abuse, and now on top of that, because of the bad system that is out there, if I also go to jail, why would I want to take that kind of a risk? But there are several other situations, not just when it comes to marriage, but even otherwise, where laws which favor women, just like any other law which is created for the benefit of one section of society, which are abused. But the problem here is that the way that Indian men are not aware at all about what can happen to them if they. So I say, God forbid, just on the off chance that as a man, you also encounter a woman who you get married to, or you are planning to marry, or you are in a relationship with, or maybe you've just married, what are the things you should know about? In fact, I say that if someone says, why not have a talk about things that women should know before getting married, what I would say is that if a client comes to me and if that client is a woman, I am not going to talk to her about all the false cases that men go through. Similarly, when a man who is a client comes to me, or who's a potential client who comes to me, I'm not going to tell him how women have been victimized over the past several centuries. I'm going to get to the core of the matter. So according to me, having a webinar where we are talking about both the facets is not really going to benefit everybody. If we want a seminar for what women should know, we can definitely do that on some other occasion. But I have written a book, and I plan to dive into the 7 things that a man should know before getting married. So chapter 1, even if she has no proof, you will likely go to jail if she files a dowry harassment case against you. There is section 498A of the Indian Penal Code, which was enacted to benefit wives who are victims of cruelty meted out to the wife for a dowry demand. Apart from that, of course, lawyers who are here will also know, but again, we are doing this for the benefit of the general public. When a woman files a case, and I don't say that every woman files a case like this, every woman will adopt all these measures, but as a matter of practice, as a matter of practice that we see in courts every single day, when we see a complaint filed by a wife alleging offenses by the husband, usually, in fact, every single case that I have seen, I see these following allegations. There will be section 498A of the Indian Penal Code, cruelty for the purpose of dowry. There is section 406 of the Indian Penal Code, which is criminal breach of trust. The allegation in criminal breach of trust is that the jewelry of the wife is still with the husband or the husband's family and is yet to be recovered, and that they had misappropriated that jewelry, saying that it is kept with them for safekeeping. Apart from that, almost invariably, it depends from case to case scenario. There are sections such as section 323, which is simple hurt, maybe section 325 of the IPC, which is grievous hurt. On occasions, I have seen wives file false cases of causing miscarriage, which is punishable under section 313 of the Indian Penal Code. There is also, of course, the dreaded, very, very dreaded section 377 of the Indian Penal Code, the offense of unnatural intercourse. Now, what happens here, what is relevant over here is that it's a very, very serious offense, section 377. Of course, there was a Supreme Court judgment, on specific aspects of section 377, but now, especially in the past few years, almost every wife wants to add section 377. And again, I say that it's not every wife, of course, it's the lawyer who, as a matter of legal strategy, wants to add section 377. So section 377, unnatural intercourse, where the wife's complaint is that my husband forced either oral intercourse or anal intercourse on me. And of course, anal intercourse, there is a checkup done, but I have seen in a lot of occasions, the courts are also apprehensive in granting even bail to the husband when they see an allegation of 377. They say, we are not going to grant anticipatory bail. Let the person go into custody and let the investigation happen. Only then will we come to a conclusion. Now, of course, when a devious, mischievous wife who wants to take revenge and who wants to file false cases, if she does these things, it becomes very difficult for the husband to get bail. I personally represented a client who spent 1 month inside jail, despite the fact that, of course, when we have conversations in the public, a lot of people say, how do you know he's innocent? How do you know that she is guilty or she's filing a false case? Well, I am the counsel for the person. I have access to all the evidence which is there. And because of that, I know precisely what is true and what is not true, because we have documentary proof. We have inconsistencies in the oral testimony, which shows us exactly what is true and what is not. And in these kind of situations, there are several other offenses which are also complained of by the wife. We'll get into that. And there are several other things as well. Now, the problem with these offenses is that although the Supreme Court in the case of Arnesh Kumar versus State of Bihar, and in fact, this judgment was also on this point that Mr. Arnesh Kumar himself also suffered needless investigation and a lot of he faced a lot of trouble. I'm not privy to the exact facts of the case, but I can imagine when the matter went up to the Supreme Court and directions were passed in a matter like this, Mr. Anesh Kumar also faced litigation like this. He went right up to the Supreme Court, where the Supreme Court said that in cases such as these and cases punishable with up to 7 years of imprisonment, the police should not immediately arrest the person, but instead wait, investigate into the matter further. And if they wish to arrest the person, they need to give reasons as to why they need custody of this accused person. The difficulty with even after Anesh Kumar is that for a few months, for maybe a year or so, prosecutors and the police were apprehensive in arresting persons, arresting husbands in these 498A, 406, 323, 34, 377 matters. However, once the police, the prosecutors realize that the only impediment to actually going and arresting the husband is that they need to give cogent reasons in writing, and permission from a particular police officer is required. That is all that is needed, and they are able to manage that. And that is why when a client comes to me and asks me whether they can be arrested, I still tell them that there is, no matter what the Supreme Court says, there is still a 1 in 1,000 chance that they can be arrested by the police. They can have, or that there is a very, very big chance that if you are summoned to the police station by the police officers, they can very well say that they summon you, you go there to the police station, you give your statement to the police. However, the police will still make a recording to the effect that we interrogated the person, he is not cooperating with the investigation, and that is why we need custodial interrogation, and then the police can arrest you. This is the first thing that men should know. Even if you are innocent, even if your wife has no proof as to the allegations that she is leveling against you, there is a small chance you can still go to jail for just being married to a woman who wants to file a false case against you. Thing two, if things do not work out, the law mandates that you will pay maintenance to your wife for life, even after divorce. There is somehow this misconception among the general public that after a divorce, the husband is not liable to pay any maintenance to the wife. That is incorrect. The law, at least when it comes to Hindu law, the law assumes that once you are married, even after divorce, until the woman remarries, the husband is liable to provide maintenance to the wife. And this becomes the main focal point for matrimonial dispute nowadays, when we represent the husband and someone else represents the wife. For the wife or for the husband, the main focal point nowadays always becomes maintenance, and even alimony for that matter. The law which is there to provide a wife with maintenance is Section 125 of the Criminal Procedure Code. There is the Domestic Violence Act, which apart from other remedies also provides for interim maintenance. There is also the Hindu Marriage Act, which when a wife seeks permanent alimony, there is also a provision for interim maintenance for that. The difficulty is that even if things did not work out, even if you are not at fault, the law says that a wife who is unable to maintain herself has to be given maintenance by the husband. On a matter of general principle, I agree that you cannot leave your wife who is dependent on you desolate, and you can't leave her out on the street to fend for herself. When you have the means, you must support her if she is your wife and you are the errant party. But then, having dealt with so many cases, I ask myself, would I, as a husband, be ready to provide maintenance to a wife who has committed adultery, who has perhaps cheated on me? Or would I want to provide maintenance to a wife who has left me without any reason, despite me being a good husband, and who wants to live separately from me, and who still wants me to provide maintenance for her? Or would I still want to provide maintenance to my wife who earns a decent living for herself, but in a court of law, she misrepresents that she is not earning any money because she has now become part of India's cash based economy where she is getting her salary off the books? Or maybe she has a business of her own where, again, the whole transaction is cash. So she has no record of her making any money. In those kind of in those kind of situations where my wife is maybe, has committed adultery, or if my wife, does not want to live with me, maybe she does not like me, or she, for no valid reason, she doesn't want to live with me, and if she is earning good money herself, in that kind of a scenario, would I want to pay maintenance to my wife? And or should a man be forced to pay maintenance to his wife? I think not. Now, some people say, if my wife is an adulterer, do I still need to pay maintenance to her? And the answer, in fact, sadly, is yes. The law says that only when a wife is living in an adulterous relationship, then the husband is not liable to pay money. And there are several judgments to the effect that if a wife has committed one or two or few number of instances of adultery, she is still entitled to maintenance from the husband. Which means that if your wife has a lover, which happened very recently in a case of mine, a husband, a very, very nice guy. I know him personally for a long amount of time now. The man found out that his wife, his newly wedded wife, has been having an affair even before the wedding, and she's still going and meeting her lover. And he came and asked me, what should I do? And this is precisely what I told him. Of course, I gave him a copy of my book. I told him that, no, in fact, I had not written this book by then, but of course, I went into this whole tirade about what all she can do if she has that kind of a bent of mind. And, it was just a guess on my part, but this is precisely what happened. The moment, and so of course we did a little strategizing. We sought the appropriate remedy in court. And the day that she received the notice of these the things that we sought, she immediately went to the Crimes Against Women cell in the concerned residential area, and she filed a complaint about nothing but dowry harassment, that my husband used to beat me for dowry. And of course, I know that my client knows that he never sought that my client never not sought any money from her, that my client never touched her. He was the subjugated one in the relationship, and yet now he is going to suffer through long and tedious litigation. Anyways, and of course, because the wife does not earn as much as him, when she goes and files a maintenance petition, if we are not able to conclusively show that she was in an adulterous relationship and living in adultery, my client will still have to pay maintenance to this wife. Moving on, even your parents and siblings will go to jail. There are a lot of situations, again, people think hum inki shaadi kara dete hain, and then we keep them in a separate house, whatever they do. And that's a very common mindset that is there in India, we get the boy and the girl married, and then we shift them, we give them a home of their own, and we shift them out, and they can fight, they can reconcile, they can do whatever they want over there. We have nothing to do with these people. And there have been several clients who, the moment the wife leaves the house, they put out an advertisement in the newspaper saying that I have disowned my son because he keeps getting into disputes, because they think that is somehow going to help the husband, or that they will escape liability, or that they will escape any sort of court processes if they put out an advertisement like that. It does not help them. I have the same case in which a client went to jail for the allegation of Section 377 purely, being a husband, without any substantial proof to that effect. In that same case, the father of the husband also spent about a month in jail because of the allegation of causing miscarriage of the woman. And also the fact that the allegation, of course, was that he molested his daughter-in-law. So parents, siblings are also not safe. If a man has a brother, and if a wife says, I want to file a false case against my husband, she will not spare the brother or the father-in-law, the father or the brother. There will be allegations of Section 354, which is outraging the modesty of a woman, and there'll also be an allegation of Section 509, which is words, gestures, and actions to outrage the modesty of a woman. And apart from that, I've seen other situations as well. There is 323, 325, and of course, the limitations are only limited to the limitations to these complaints are only limited by the imagination of the lawyers who are drafting the complaints of the wife. And there is no escaping this either for the parents either. There is substantial difficulty in getting anticipatory bail for the father-in-law, for the brother-in-law. I remember a particular case where a client approached me and said that his brother's wife left the house, and knowing that there is a huge doubt on matrimonial offenses nowadays. Whenever a wife files a 498A case, the police, the lawyers, the judge also, to a good extent, assumes, or does, if they do not assume, they at least take it with a little pinch of salt. They think that, with all these like large number of false cases which are going on, there is a small possibility that the case is false. And even then, so that is the reason why the wife of my client, the wife of my client's brother filed nothing. No 498A, no 406, no 323, no 325, no 354, no 377. She only filed a 376, that is a rape case against her brother-in-law, that is my client. And I had to give a hats off to her, the intellect of the woman, because of course I'm not saying that we know for sure that it's a false case if she has filed a case against him, but because my client comes to me and tells me the entire scenario, and of course I will believe him, at least to the purpose of the interaction between me and him, that when she has filed a Section 376 complaint against the brother-in-law, there is no chance that the brother-in-law will escape jail. He will go to jail. He will suffer incarceration. It will be very, very difficult for him to get anticipatory bail. The reason why is because the husband, the wife, and the brother-in-law all live together in the same house. And if the complaint of the woman is that I was subjugated to sexual abuse for several months or several years, there is no point in even any MLC being done. In fact, to that extent, even if there is an MLC, if the woman has had sexual intercourse with her husband, there is no way that, unless she has reported the matter immediately to the police and they can collect semen samples from the vagina, there is no possibility that this man will be able to get anticipatory bail very, very easily. So the summation of this particular chapter, this particular subtopic, is that if your wife files a false case against you, there is a very good chance that she will file a false case against your father as well as your brother. A lot of times I have seen even sisters being implicated. Allegations will be again of cruelty, 498A, of hurt, of maybe grievous hurt. There are all sorts of situations I've seen over the years. Moving on. If you back out of the marriage, she can file a rape or a sexual harassment case against you. Now, this is a very new thing that has kind of come up that I have seen in my practice. Of course, I'm guessing it has been going since, ever since women have been subjugated, women have been oppressed for centuries. Ever since these laws for the protection of women have been passed, there have been misuse as well by a certain number of women. And I've been in the past few months seeing a surge, at least in my practice, of women who, after, if an engagement breaks, a woman files a false case of molestation or rape or sexual harassment. And it could be coincidence, I don't want to call it a statistic, but in all the cases that I have been representing, and there have not been hundreds of them, but maybe around a dozen or so, almost invariably, maybe it is just destiny, all the cases that come to me are those which the man and the woman met on a matrimonial website, or a newspaper, or an advertisement section of a website, or maybe actual physical newspapers. So I don't know what the reason is. I'm not going to comment that arranged marriages or these kind of matrimonial websites are the reason. Statistically, I have seen, be it an arranged marriage or be it a love marriage, things can always fall apart. It's just a matter of incompatibility, perhaps, or there are so many other factors as incompatibility. There is, and on of course, the handful of occasions, there is always the inherent pre-existing bad intention of one of the parties. And so what happens is, in these kind of situations, if the marriage does not go through, is that the wife cannot, the woman now, not the wife, the ex-fiance or the ex-girlfriend now can file a false rape case, or a harassment case, or a molestation case, or an outraging the modesty of a woman case, or a stalking case, or a voyeurism case. There are all sorts of allegations which are leveled. There is also an offense of Dowry Prohibition Act, which can be a person can be charged with even if the marriage did not take place, because the allegation is of demand of dowry, which comes under section 3 and 4 of the Dowry Prohibition Act, if my memory serves me right. And what's been happening in all these cases is, again, the story always goes that he and I were in a relationship, or we were together, and we had gotten engaged, and he molested me, or he assaulted me, or he attempted to rape me, or he raped me. But I kept quiet because of the fact that when I told my parents, or I did not choose to tell my parents, because I thought that anyways we are going to get married, and let us not make a big hue and cry about the situation. Clients come to me, so many of them, and they show me concrete proof which completely falsifies the allegations of the wife, or the ex-fiance, the ex-girlfriend, in this kind of a situation. And it is very, very disheartening that men who have done nothing wrong, who have not been perpetrators of any sort, face these allegations and have to run to court on several occasions to get anticipatory bail. They spend money on lawyers, they have sleepless nights, they run around, they spend all sorts of money. On a lot of these occasions, I have seen the man pay a bribe to the woman, a man just paying off the woman so that she can get what she wants. In fact, a lot of these cases, when it is a false case, it is nothing less than extortion. In fact, in fact, let's not even go into the strategies that we go to. We can maybe talk about that in the later stages of this webinar. I'll move on to the next topic, the subtopic, which is, she will claim domestic violence, seek compensation, and throw you out of your house. Now, the Domestic Violence Act, which was passed in the year 2005, is a fantastic piece of legislation. Some very prominent lawyers helped in the drafting of that legislation, and it has worked wonders for empowering women across the country. However, there are several challenges which a man faces when he is falsely accused by his wife. So when a wife files a false case against the husband, it is almost always a kind of a packet like a package of a bunch of things. First and foremost, the wife goes and files a case of, dowry harassment and all these other offenses that I've mentioned. Apart from that, she files an application for maintenance under Section 125 of the CRPC. We've discussed that as well. A lot of occasions she files for divorce, and then she seeks permanent alimony, and of course, as well as along with that, she asks for interim maintenance. And apart from that, a wife, when she files a false case, also files a petition under the Domestic Violence Act. The Domestic Violence Act says that a victim of domestic violence, and the ambit of domestic violence is much wider than the definition of cruelty for the purpose of dowry. So of course, cruelty for the purpose of dowry does come under the ambit of domestic violence. But apart from that, the Domestic Violence Act gives a very vast definition of domestic violence. Domestic violence can be anything which is physical, emotional, mental, even financial. And once the wife files a petition, let us forget about the truthfulness on the merits, because the matter takes years to come to any conclusion, and for the husband in a false case to prove that all of these allegations are false. In initial stage itself, there are several things that a man falsely accused faces. Things such as paying interim maintenance, that is one. Another big grouse is residence orders under shared household. Now, the Domestic Violence Act says that a victim of domestic violence is entitled to residence orders in the same shared household where the husband and wife were residing together at the time of marriage. And of course, there are judgments which kind of carve out this thing that the husband should have at least some semblance of ownership in the premises in which they were staying. It cannot be a rental accommodation. It also cannot be your parents' property. If you're staying at the husband's parents' property, the woman is not entitled to residence orders. However, if the husband has a certain share, if the husband is even part owner of the premises in which they were staying together, and she even alleges domestic violence, she gets residence orders. Now, normally, I think it's fantastic that a wife, if she has suffered subjugation, if she has suffered humiliation, if she suffered any sort of atrocity by her husband, she should get this protection, because a lot of times a woman has no other place to go. The husband should provide, the law should intervene and provide inside the husband's own house, and even remove the husband from that house. But in case it's a false allegation, in case the wife is in an adulterous relationship, in the wife, from her own accord, she has left the house, or because of just incompatibility issues, but no domestic violence meted out to her, she now wants to for the sole purpose of getting more money from her husband at the time of separation, she should not be allowed to misuse that. And that is precisely what I see happening in a lot of cases. What happens is that she will, after all these allegations, she will file a petition, she will seek maintenance, she will seek residence orders. And there are also provisions for, provisions of a protection officer, removing the husband himself from the shared household. And because of that, the Domestic Violence Act also becomes something which can be a serious cause for concern for a man who is falsely accused by his wife. Moving on. She will get to keep the children, and you will have to pay for their upbringing. Now, this is a very sensitive topic, again, because the way the law favors women when it comes to child custody rights. I've had several husbands, fathers come to me and say that the wife filed a false allegation against them, has now, and of course took, when she left the house, she took the child or the children with her, and she now does not let him meet the children. And because of that, he suffers a lot of emotional stress, the fact that he is not able to meet his children. The law says that if the child is young, I believe it's younger than 5 or 6 years of age, the the first choice should be the mother. The mother should be the one who should be having custody of the child. And it is only in exceptional circumstances that a father can get custody of the child. To be honest, I have not done many custody matters through and through, because of which I'm not an expert in these kind of in the topic of custody rights. But what I do know is that once the wife takes the child, even if the husband is not at fault, and if it's a case of false allegations, the husband suffers severe repercussions, because one, he does not get to see the child, but more importantly, the woman, when she has filed a false case, will seek maintenance for the child and use the money which is granted by the court as maintenance for the welfare of the child. She will use that money the way she seems fit, but on a lot of occasions, she will use that money to fuel the litigation expenses against the husband. And that is why I have a lot of clients who come to me and they say that I do not wish to pay maintenance to my wife for the welfare of the child, because I know that the money that goes to her will be utilized by her for the purpose of fueling more litigation against me. And because of that, a lot of husbands are more inclined towards taking care of the expenses of the child directly, such as depositing the amount of money in the school directly, such as paying for whatever expenses of the child there is directly. The problem on certain occasions, I feel, is that one major grouse that I have is, I have not personally dealt with any of these cases, but the law exists, and because of that, it is very it seems almost absurd to me that even in today's age you will have a scenario like this. The Evidence Act mandates, now I don't remember the section number, but the Evidence Act gives an irrebuttable presumption that a child born within a certain number of days, now I don't even remember the number of days of wedlock, a child born within a certain number of days of the wedlock will be presumed to be the child of the husband will be presumed to be the father of the child, and that no evidence can be given to rebut that presumption, which makes it an irrebuttable presumption. So no matter what evidence you give to show that the child for whose welfare you are being ordered to pay maintenance, just in case there is an adulterous relationship and the wife bears a child out of an adulterous relationship, you still have to pay maintenance for that child, and the law will not allow you to produce any evidence to show that the child is not yours, and therefore you should not be liable to pay maintenance for that child. Now, of course, I believe in the year 2000, I think it was 2014 or 2015, that the Supreme Court, yes, so Anu writes section 122 of the Indian Evidence Act in 280 days. Thank you for that, Anu. That provision is there. And of course, we are talking about very, very few minute cases, maybe a handful of cases, maybe a couple of dozens of cases. But the thing which is there, the thing which men should know about when they get married in India is that just in case your wife bears a child of some other man during the time of your marriage, even then you will be held to be the father and you will have to pay maintenance for that child. That is just one small thing that you should also know about. And apart from that, there are several other challenges when it comes to custody rights as well. There is the fact that, of course, there is maintenance that is there. Then now another thing that I kind of missed out while discussing one of the other subtopics is the aspect of jurisdiction. Now, very, very, very recently, the Supreme Court kind of decided finally on the issue. But before that, and again, handful, maybe a couple of hundred situations that we have seen this kind of happen. But when it does happen, the husband suffers tremendously when it's a false case. Say the parties get married in Delhi, and then the wife goes to Bombay, back to her parents' house, and now she wants to file a false case. Or let's, like, for this purpose, for what I'm trying to explain, she wants to file a case, maybe false or maybe may be true against her husband and maybe sometimes her husband's family members. There was a huge debate for several years, running more than a decade, about where should she be allowed to file her complaint, which place should have jurisdiction to investigate into the offenses. In this case, should it be Delhi or should it be Bombay? And for several years, there were several differing judgments on these two views. One school of thought said that if the offense has been committed in Delhi, then Delhi should have jurisdiction to entertain, and any complaint filed in Bombay should also be transferred to Delhi to investigate. However, and the other school of thought was that if the woman has come pursuant to the offense being committed in Bombay, in Delhi, she has come to Bombay, the act of her traveling to the other city will also constitute the requisite criteria under the CRPC, and therefore even Bombay courts will have jurisdiction, even the Bombay police will have jurisdiction and the power to investigate into the offense. The Supreme Court finally put an end to this issue, and in a 3-judge bench finally decided that according to the CRPC, if a woman goes to Bombay from Delhi, she can still file a case in Bombay. Now, because of that, I have personally seen in multiple cases that a wife deliberately goes back to her to her parents' house, or to maybe some other city where it's more convenient for her to live, and she deliberately files a case against her husband and her in-laws against in the same city that she is living. And because of that, now every single time the husband and his relatives have to go to the particular place that she has filed that complaint. So and in fact, to go a step ahead, I have seen cases, and I don't know how these are anomalies, but this is what happens. This is the kind of victimization that happens against men when it does happen. And what happens is that, and I've seen this happen, that the wife maybe is still in Delhi, but the wife's father files a complaint somewhere, thousands of kilometers away where he lives, saying that matrimonial offenses have been committed against my daughter in Delhi. And even then, the police are happy to register an FIR over there. What happens is that the father will say, or the girl will come back to her parents' house, file that complaint, and then leave to go wherever it suits her. And now, even though the girl is not there in the same city as she has filed the complaint, the boy has to travel to far away jurisdictions, and the girl knows that, and that is why she uses that as a leverage to be able to negotiate a better amount of alimony when the parties finally come to an agreement. And these are all the things which plague men who are falsely accused by women, either as husbands or as ex-lovers or as ex-boyfriends, ex-fiancés. Now, the last thing that a man should know before he gets married is that, having talked about all of these other things, there are a few things that a man can do. And I'll talk about some of the other problems that a man faces, and then how to kind of counter that by doing this one small thing. A couple of years ago, a friend of mine called me up and told me that because he has heard me on numerous occasions talk about the kind of false cases that are being filed by some women against men, and that he was getting married, and that to an arranged marriage very soon, and he wondered if there is something that can be done to ensure that there is a minimal possibility of his wife filing a false case against him. So I explained to him that prenuptial agreements in India don't hold any value. Of course, because one thing is that the allegations of offenses which are committed can only be determined at a later stage. There can be no contract between the parties that the woman will not file a case of dowry harassment or criminal breach of trust or any of these other things against her husband. That cannot be done. Apart from that, the aspect of maintenance, even that the courts of law have said that a prenuptial agreement which defines the amount of maintenance, or which says that in case there is a separation, the wife or the spouse does not get any maintenance, that is contrary to an Indian law, and that is why under the Contract Act, it is void. Any agreement which is in contravention of any law in India is void as per the Contract Act. And therefore, prenuptial agreements cannot govern any relationship between the parties, in India. But I told him that there are certain benefits to having what I call a quasi prenup. Because what happens is that in these kind of false allegations, when a woman does file false allegations, there is another, like there are a couple of allegations which are also very difficult for a man to deal with at a later stage. Allegations such as 1 crore rupees was spent in the marriage by me, or 2 crore rupees were given as dowry by me. And you can, of course, you can change the number depending on the status of the parties. The allegations are always stretched out to quite an extent. At least with having this kind of a document that I prepared for this friend then, because in this particular friend's situation, they did not even have a wedding, the grand Hindu wedding celebration. They actually got married in a temple with their parents, because they had that kind of a society. And therefore I drafted this very simple agreement. I don't even remember now whether it was an agreement with both the parties or whether it was just an affidavit by the wife, which stated that no dowry was demanded or given by either of the parties, that a certain amount of jewelry worth this much was brought in by the wife, and that the wife is working. And there are other facets as well, because there is sometimes an allegation that I used to work and I was told that I will not be allowed to work, or that I was earlier told that I will be allowed to work, but later I was told that I will not be allowed to work. Stuff like that. Things which we know, usually a woman, when she files a false case, she will file all these false allegations. These can be kind of dealt with by a lawyer practicing matrimonial laws preemptively. So this is what I did for this friend, and this is what I have since been doing for a few people here and there. Of course, the biggest challenge that comes for men is that they say, they ask me, how do I broach this topic? How do I tell my wife that I want her to sign a piece of paper which says that no dowry has been demanded or has been given? And I explained to the friend, the client, whoever it is, that it is definitely a very, very uncomfortable conversation to have. But looking at least at my track record of the kind of cases that I've been dealing with, of course, I'm not going to say every woman files false cases. There are a handful in the entire population. There are a handful who, with a bad intention, who with a nefarious intention, file a false case. But when they do, and if you are lucky enough to have one of those wives who files a false case against you, the kind of pain and suffering that you will go through, the kind of money that you will have to pay as alimony, the kind of money you will have to pay to lawyers to get anticipatory bail, the kind of money you will have to pay to lawyers to get to fight all these petitions that a wife will file against you, it is much better to just have this uncomfortable conversation with your wife or your to-be wife right now. And so not just before the marriage, but even immediately after the marriage, or maybe a few months into the marriage. This advice, according to me, goes to all men out there. When you know that this kind of a situation is there, that once a dispute happens, there is I'm not saying that once a dispute happens, every wife will do this. In fact, I have seen on several occasions wives who are clients, and sometimes wives who appear for, on the other side. The wives say that they do not wish to file any case at all, even if perhaps it is warranted. There have been situations where a wife says, I have suffered, but I do not want to. In fact, there have been occasions where a wife has come to me and I've told them that under the legal definition, she has actually suffered domestic violence and she should file for domestic violence. She should file a petition. And she refuses. She says, I do not wish to file any case. I just want to move on with my life. So I'm not saying that every single woman will file a case, but if there is a woman who will file a false case, in all likelihood, you will not find a woman who will file a false case on one small aspect and not on the other aspects. When you do chance upon a person who will file a false case against you, that person will file false cases against you on all aspects and will attack on all fronts. Because if they have a bad intention from a specific angle, they will try to cover it from all angles. And that is why these quasi prenups, as I call them fondly, are of extreme importance. Apart from that, there is another thing that I kind of talk about when it comes to maybe not during marriage, but prior to marriage. If you're dating, or if you're in a relationship, documenting your relationship is kind of important. In fact, of course, a lot of people will talk about when we talk about these kind of cases, there is in matrimonial law, there is section 377 of the IPC, which is forced unnatural intercourse. Now then the question of rape and consent and proof of consent comes up. Another thing that men do not know is that under the Evidence Act, there are two provisions which are, again, of course, which were passed by the legislature with good reason, but are from time to time misused by women. But when they are misused, it causes severe prejudice to the man for no fault of his. One provision of the Evidence Act, and I'm extremely bad with sections, so I don't remember section. Someone can maybe kind of point out that section. One section says that if there is an allegation of rape and it is proved that the man and the woman did have sexual intercourse, then the burden will shift on the man to prove that. All right, so someone saying 114B, I don't remember. I'm really bad at remembering sections, but I remember the provision. And the provision says that if the allegation is of rape and sexual intercourse is proved to have happened, then the onus shifts on the man to prove that there was consent, which goes against the fundamental tenet of the law of evidence, that you are innocent until proven guilty, A, and B, that the burden of proof to establish a conviction is not on the accused person, but on the prosecution. The burden of proof is on the prosecution to establish that there was actually rape which is committed. However, because of the Evidence Act and because of this provision in the Evidence Act, if a woman, so let us talk about it in a practical scenario. If I am in a relationship with a woman, and the woman goes to court, and the woman goes to the police and says that Amish Agarwal raped her, then and Amish Agarwal agrees and says that yes, there was sexual intercourse, but then he says that sexual intercourse was consensual, then the burden of proving that sexual intercourse was consensual automatically falls upon the shoulders of Amish Agarwal, and then the state will have to no longer prove that there was no consent. And one can practically imagine how difficult it is for a man to, when he is faced with a false allegation of rape, to prove that he actually that he had the consent. And this is something that men don't know about, and that is again something that you as a man in a relationship, or maybe in an engagement, should kind of know about. Another provision which is there, which also men should have knowledge of, which is there, again I completely am in the favor of having these provisions of law, because in this vast country with hundreds of millions of population, there are all sorts of atrocities, and at the end of the day, we cannot deny, if there are the people in fact, a lot of people peg me as a men's rights activist, and I always have to tell them, no, I am not a men's rights activist, because at the end of the day, I understand that in this country, statistically, there are way many more women victims of a particular crime because of which that legislation exists. However, there is also another rule of evidence which is not really discussed much even in trials, and that is why I just want to kind of put it out there, that if there is an allegation of rape, the prior sexual history of the woman cannot be called into question. That is it. As an academic debate, it has always kind of gone on in my mind that if perhaps I am in a relationship with a woman and we've had sexual intercourse on multiple occasions, and if the woman goes and files a complaint with the police saying that on this particular occasion, I did not give consent. Right? The burden of proof. If I agree that we did have sexual intercourse, the burden of proof, of course, automatically shifts on me, because now I have to prove that there was consent. But on top of that, according to me, I have never seen a case like this. I'm not sure whether the court would practically consider this or not. But the fact that the woman and I have had sexual intercourse on prior occasions because of this provision of the Evidence Act might not even allow me to provide as evidence or to adduce as evidence the testimony or the proof or evidence, the fact that we have had sexual intercourse on several other occasions. And of course, prior sexual intercourse does not mean that you have the right to violate the other person, and to not care about consent. However, in a case of section 376 Indian Penal Code, it does assume relevance. It cannot be the sole deciding factor, but it cannot assume it cannot be completely thrown out. Prior sexual history with the same person that the allegation is against cannot be thrown out. That is what I personally feel. I might be wrong. There might be cases out there. There might be cases where the rulings are that, all right, so Naveen Kumarji says some judgments which say the history is not completely relevant. I am grateful to you. Then I can perhaps set this apart, and Naveen ji can in fact even send me these judgments, because frankly I have never dealt with a case like this. I have had situations, very, very close calls, but again, these kind of things get take far this thing. Yes, so it's 7:10 already. I think I have said almost everything that I've had to say. There are a lot of points. I feel very rusty nowadays because of the whole lockdown situation. So I might have not covered a few points here and there, but I think this was like the overall gist of all the things that I've kind of dealt with as a lawyer for several men, as husbands, as boyfriends, as fiancés. I would love to take up any questions that people might have, but I'll have to be honest. My experience or the things that I've talked about comes from only the cases that I have dealt with, and there are several knowledge gaps. So if I don't know the answer to a question, I would humbly just admit it and then perhaps get back to you with the right answer. We can go ahead then.
Thank you very much, Amesh ji, for this wonderful presentation. In fact, we have seen many webinars on men's RIA, but I think this is the first of its kind on men's rights. In fact, we are very, very much honored to have you on board and give such a wonderful and inspiring presentation. So, new age problems need new age solutions. Only we need to place on record that even though in India we need stringent laws for women, for the protection of women's rights, at the same time we cannot deny the fact that many false cases of late have been filed against men and their family as well. And as a matter of fact, a welfare law brought in specifically for the welfare of a certain group shall always tilt towards that particular group. But at the same time, after a certain stage, there needs to be an introspection as to whether the law's purpose is met or defeated, because a coin will have two sides to it. And this session, in which you have covered most of the points, are very relevant to the new age problems that men are facing. And I am sure what are the points you have discussed today, and also the book which you have written, will definitely help people, at least for the aggrieved people, to get certain solution from them, from these two webinar as well as from the books. I once again tell you this session was very refreshing, and I thank you, Amish ji, for this. You are like my brother, and you readily accepted my invitation without any second thought.
Of course, Anand Bhai called me. How could I say no? That had to be done.
So on behalf of our team and on my personal behalf, I thank you very much for this, Amish ji. Now we have got certain questions from audience as well. But first, let us move to the next segment called APLC's APLC, Ask the Learned Counsel. We have prepared a few questions from our end, and if you are ready, we will just start with the first one.
I'll try my best.
Yeah, thank you. And you touched upon a certain point where you said accounting certain things are very important. Talking about adultery, No, no. When you were giving your presentation, you touched
Yes.
upon certain things called accounting certain things, taking stock of certain things, keeping record of certain things.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So that is something that I kind of, yes, I kind of kept talking and then I forgot about it.
Yes.
Um, okay, this is also a little this is definitely a little controversial. Whenever I mention it to, some people, they accuse me of misogyny, and but I'll still kind of go ahead and mention this because I say this as a lawyer. I have in fact talked about it on numerous other occasions. In fact, I'd say not just on when it comes to relationships, marriages, or relationships of a girlfriend, boyfriend, or whatever nature. I say that a person, every person, irrespective of gender, should maintain records of everything that is going on in their lives. Now, there have been occasions where um, so I'll give an example of what I meant by records. I know of a client whose case is still going on, where he had a relationship with a married woman. Now, the day that the married woman, the woman's husband, found out about the relationship, the husband confronted the wife, who cooked up a nice little story of how this her boyfriend had kind of forced the relationship on her and kept sexually harassing her into the point of to the point of to this extent that she had no other option but to kind of just entertain him, because he was apparently, that's the story that she concocted, that he was in a position of authority over her at the workplace. Now, because of that, an allegation of section 354A was filed against the client. And this client, the mistake that he did, and this is the reference that I make, is the several hundreds of messages which were exchanged between the client and his lover, the married woman. This man conveniently forgot about everything and sold off his phone. And along with his phone, he, you know, threw away all of the data, all of the messages that were there between him and his lover, because of which our work between became much more difficult to be able to establish in the court of law. When the matter is going on now, it is much more difficult for us to establish that there was actually a relationship and this was not a case of harassment or stalking that the woman is trying to make it out to be. Similarly, when it comes to relationships, when it comes to equations like these, there it is always better to kind of have a record of whatever's going on. So if you have, say, a mobile phone, right, try to keep all the messages intact. In fact, I keep it as a policy. I keep all my messages intact no matter what. It is sacrosanct, my bible. I don't know when I'll get into a problem with a client. I don't know if I'll get into a problem with with maybe my girlfriend, or my employees, anybody for that matter. So I always try to keep every single message over here saved, so that in the future, if someone has any sort of allegation of not just of a sexual nature, but there are so many other things. In fact, one thing that comes to my mind is a couple of months ago, I in the high court, I went in front of a judge and I said that the registry prevented me from doing a particular thing that this court directed me to do. And the court, of course, these allegations are thrown around everywhere all the time. There was very recently a petition in the Supreme Court which alleged that that certain lawyers are given preference over other lawyers, right? And of course, we as all the lawyers sitting over here know the truthfulness of that petition, know how much truth there is, right? But it is very, and I understand it's a nuanced point. The registry has its limitations, but in this particular situation, I also had a similar grouse. I said the registry stopped me, and the judge, again, in this situation also, the judge said, you, like, all you lawyers are very, very quick at coming blaming the registry because the registry does not have a voice. And so I am going to set up an inquiry against you, Mr. Counsel, for putting this baseless allegation against the registry. And for a second, of course, I was shocked at the strong words used by the court, but I knew I was not lying, and I knew that there is sufficient record that I have with me, because of which I was able to tell the honorable judge that, the judge might very well proceed. Now, when the registrar of the Delhi High Court was directed to conduct an inquiry into my allegation of how I was prevented, I was actually able to go up to the registrar and hand him a compact disc containing an audio recording between me and the person of that registry, the one person who had prevented me from filing that particular document that the court had directed me to file. And when that registrar took that compact disc, he asked me, Mr. Agarwal, are you recording this particular conversation as well? So this is the kind of meticulousness that, I mean, I don't know if meticulousness is a word or not. This is the kind of, meticulous behavior that I try to keep with myself, because having a record is not important just for, for relationships, for marriage, but for every step of your life. You need to have records. And that is why, in fact, I record all the audio conversations in my phone. I record every single conversation that comes. And a lot of people, what they do is they will wipe off their memory clean, because there are too many audio recordings in the phone. I have automatic call recording, right? And too many audio call recordings are there, and people delete them because they think nothing's going to happen. But you don't know what is going to happen 6 months down the line, or 1 year down the line, or 5 years down the line. Now, I come back to the same example, the first person example that I gave in this webinar. A man who is falsely accused by his girlfriend of having raped her. If he had, if he had all the text messages saved, if he had all the call recordings with that girlfriend saved, I am assuming, of course, I don't know, what happened with him. I just had this very one small question that the woman posed. But I say that if that man had all these call recordings, these text messages exchanged between him and her, he would be able to show to the court that there is a different story than what is being alleged. That is what I meant by keeping a record.
Yes, thank you, Amish ji. But talking about,
in fact, on this point, I remember there was this case that had happened in Bombay, where this man went a little too overboard with keeping a record. So this one comedian who had a one night stand with this one lady, he had an audio recording of the sexual intercourse that took place between them. And when the woman complained that this how can you, this is an invasion of my privacy, how could you record us having sexual intercourse together, he faced a lot of backlash online. And his explanation was that in this Me Too era, I am afraid of false allegations against me. What am I supposed to do? Of course, it did not constitute an offense in any way, because there is no offense under the IPC, the IT Act, which prohibits a man recording having an audio recording of sexual intercourse with a woman. I think maybe he stretched it out a little too far. He did pay the consequences with all the social stigma that he faced. But, this is again another example of something carried a little too far, I guess. Yes.
that was precisely what I was about to ask you. When we talk about adultery in a relationship, is it correct morally and legally to check the mobile phones of the spouse or girlfriend time and again, and just to ensure that there is at the same time, just to ensure that the right to privacy is also not affected? So what is the middle ground there?
Yes. So the Delhi High Court had an occasion to explore this in detail very, very recently during the lockdown period itself. And the Delhi High Court said that although we can say that yes, privacy is a fundamental right which has been now declared by the Supreme Court. However, we should not forget that a fundamental right is a right which is actionable against the state and not against individual persons. So I cannot say that I have a right to privacy and therefore another individual can be held accountable to uphold my right of privacy. And this is precisely what the Delhi High Court said in this particular situation, where a husband recorded a conversation between his wife and the wife's friend, where the wife was saying that I will file all these cases against my husband and I will teach him a lesson. So he recorded that and he produced it as evidence. And the wife said that this is an infringement of my privacy and you cannot use this as evidence, and this should not be admissible as evidence to to influence the case. And the Delhi High Court said no. The Delhi High Court allowed the audio recording to be used as evidence to show the nature of the false allegations of the wife's complaints against the husband. This is what the courts have decided till now. Maybe the Supreme Court changes its mind. We don't know, because of course there might not be a punishable offense for the violation of privacy in this kind of a sense, but it could definitely be an actionable tort. Tort law does exist in India, and say for example, in another situation, if say another topic that comes to my mind is these prank videos that come across on YouTube, right? Now, if you are making a video of, say, a woman walking on the street, fully clothed, of course, is that in any way violation of any of of course it's a violation of her privacy because her face comes on a video on YouTube. But is it a punishable offense? I think not. But at the same time, I'm not sure, I believe that if the woman files a civil suit for damages for recording her video without her consent, she could perhaps succeed, because the scope of tort law in India is quite wide compared to this. So there is a lot to be done practically, and of course a lot to be said on this topic in the future as well.
Yes, Amish ji. Thank you. Now, moving on to the next question. When parents, when the husband's parents, spouse, brothers, sisters are implicated when it comes to harassment or domestic violence, what kind of relief do the parents or the husband have when the wife disagrees to keep her in-laws along with her?
Now, this is something that I don't really have an answer to, because this is not so much to do with the law, but this is to do with what the temperament of the parties is, right? And this happens with me every single day. A wife recently came to me and she said that I want to go and live back with my husband, and she actually suffered abuse from her husband. There were beatings, there was several things happened against her. And she said that if I do want to continue living with my husband, what guarantee do I have that he's not going to repeat these offenses? And I said that there is no guarantee, that there is just the hope that the parties will reconcile with each other, and that you will kind of repent, the husband will repent his actions. The difficulty, though, Anand bhai, is that it is very easy to vilify and to say that A person is a villain and B person is the victim and not the villain, right? But the difficulty is, now if I had to kind of stand in the position of the husband in this particular situation, right? It is not a good argument. It is a very, very bad argument. But the way the husband would justify his actions of beating his wife would be that maybe she was very, very irritating, or maybe she did XYZ thing in front of ABC person, and because of these things I did this. Now, and that is why precisely wars happen. This is why the Holocaust happened, right? Like a certain section of people thought that another section of people were inherently evil, because of which several atrocious acts were committed. Now, we could very well say that Hitler was this evil being who wiped out several millions of people from the planet. But then you have to kind of see what exactly was going on over there and how he justified his actions to himself. And so similarly, in these kind of things, when it comes to matrimonial laws, when it comes to relationships between two people, there's no really concrete answer that we can have. As far as the law is concerned, the wife files the cases and seeks a remedy, and it is the husband and his relatives who kind of contest it, and who seek to minimize the impact of those cases.
Thank you, Amish. Now, moving to the questions asked by our participants. The first question is from Mr. Naveen Kumar from the Faculty of Law from DU. Whenever there is a rape case or dowry case, etc., filed by the women, the case is termed as victim, irrespective of whether the case is true or not. The question is, who is a victim? He goes on to say that he is not talking about whether the accused in the case is the one to commit the alleged offense or not. So he wants to know who is the victim, whether the person who has filed the case is a victim, or who has affected is a victim.
I am assuming you're talking about the legal definition of a victim. Now, to be honest, Anand bhai, These academic debates are a little difficult for me to. But as far as I remember, the definition of a victim, somewhere, I mean, one of these laws is that it is not just the person against whom the crime itself was committed, but also the family member, any legal representative. All these people are also termed as victims for the purpose of the law. That is what I remember. I could be wrong as well, to be honest. I've not really dealt with this kind of a situation for a very long time.
Thank you, Amish ji. Now, moving on to the next question. It is by Advocate Prakash Kumar, who is our regular participant practicing in Jharkhand High Court Ranchi. He wants to know, Amish sir, the laws says about gender equality. Then why many female cases, mostly implicated or planted, are tilted towards women, like false domestic violence case, 498A cases, maintenance cases? I think this law is based on sympathy than mere any evidences. What is your expert opinion, sir?
Well, I represent many more men than I do represent women. That is just how it has happened. More men have come to me than women looking for a lawyer. And on some occasions, I have gotten carried away talking about how bad these laws are. But once every few weeks, a female client will walk into my office and she will tell me her story. And of course, as a lawyer who has dealt with these kind of things for several years, I can kind of figure out how much of it is the truth and how much of it is a little concocted. And I always remember why the legislature has passed these laws. We can very conveniently say that even though there is no proof, all of these things happen. That is why we should call for stronger. There are multiple arguments by men's rights activists. There are arguments such as that we should not accept these offenses, these allegations, without any proof. The difficulty with that is the majority of this country, even women victims are ignorant about the law that is there in their favor. They do not know about what all can be done, and that is why if they do come forward, they do not have any proof. They don't have any proof of the fact that there was an attempt at bride burning maybe 5 years ago, or that she lost her child maybe 7 years ago, or that she was brutally beaten to the verge of death around 3 years ago. If you start asking for proof, and that too at the initial stage, and that too very strongly, and you say we are not even going to entertain any complaint in the absence of any proof, then a lot of times the possibility that there could be proof that exists. And even on certain other occasions, what is proof? The proof can also be the testimony of the victim, the testimony of the witness. So if the wife comes, and of course these things take a lot of time, the investigation, the trial. But if at trial the wife comes and gives her testimony about all of the things that have happened to her, and her testimony stands despite cross examination, then why should not a man be convicted for things that he has actually committed? One thing that I would agree with to a certain extent is how the law rushes to the help of a victim in the absence of any proof. So from what I have seen, the moment there is an allegation of section 377 nowadays, especially when we're talking about matrimonial offenses, the moment there's an allegation of 377, now 498A, the police themselves are a little reserved all the time, because they've seen so many of these cases which are misused by the wife. But the moment there is 377, they immediately rush to nab the accused person, even though there is no proof, because maybe the wife has said he forced oral intercourse or anal intercourse. Despite any proof, the police will rush to go and arrest the person. That I feel is wrong, right? And also another thing that people will say is that even though there is no proof that the man has earned so much, even though the man has not been called, there have been sometimes ex parte interim maintenance orders are given, or even after the husband is called without any evidence, maintenance orders are granted. Even then, I ask you, what is going to happen to the wife who left her parents' house, came to another city, who is dependent on you completely, and you've kicked her out of her house? What is she going to do? So on several aspects, we as especially when it comes to men who are falsely accused, they are completely blindsided by, by all of this that happens. In fact, a lot of us lawyers, when we represent a lot of husbands, we also get blindsided, and we kind of are biased against women. But ever so often we are reminded by cruel actions against women from time to time, and when they are left remediless, why in this vast country we still need to have certain provisions which protect women, which might be a little onerous from time to time against men. But at the very least, the whole purpose of this webinar is the provision should exist, but even men should know about it, just in case they have the bad fortune of coming across a person who misuses that law against them.
Thank you, Amishi. That was precisely the reason why we organized such webinar, and you exactly put it in a very apt manner. So last question coming up for the day before we wrap this session. Ms. Sushri Padmaja Malik wants to know, all these are in favor of petitioner, but how can we revoke this type of cases as respondent? So she wants to know what kind of steps can be taken from the respondent's point of view.
Defense. All right.
Yeah,
this is
defense,
very nice, because frankly, when I talk about defense strategies, I don't want to presume, because defense strategies can vary a lot. And of course, it varies from case to case basis. Couple of things that I can talk about is moving, so one thing I definitely say is, once you face allegations, you should not wait on the defense. Especially if you're falsely accused, you should not wait on the defense and wait for something to happen. Wait for the charge sheet to be filed. Wait for the wife to file her cases. And this is precisely what I, keep doing for various clients. So, so one client came to me, he told me the marriage broke off, the wife filed a molestation case against him. Now his previous lawyer said, we'll have to wait and we'll get them at cross-examination. But when I inspected the charge sheet itself mentioned that that certain bills which were submitted by the ex-fiance, the police said we were not able to verify them, because when we went to the particular places which purportedly issued those bills, they said that these bills have not been generated over here. So I said, why wait? The law is there clearly in your favor. There is the judgment of Iqbal Singh Marwa versus Meenakshi Marwa of the Supreme Court, which says that you don't need to wait for an acquittal. If there is an allegation of forgery, you can file a separate complaint for that. So I immediately moved with the client for the offense of forgery against these people. And they were, again, then the opposite side was taken on the defense side, when my client was able to exploit a legal strategy that very well existed in his favor, and he was able to kind of use it to his advantage. Another thing that I did very recently, when the client found out that his wife was having an affair, I told my client, if you go to her and you tell her that you found out that she has that you found out that she is having an affair, she is immediately going to file, there is a good chance, of course I cannot say it for certainty that she'll do it, but there's a good chance that to get money out of you, or to kind of get an amicable divorce from you, she might, or to just because she can, right, just because she can, she might file a false case against you. So I told him that rather than her finding out that you first file a petition for divorce, or in this particular case annulment, because the circumstances warranted it. We filed a petition for annulment. And the incredible part about this is that while we were researching on all the things that we can do while drafting that annulment petition, we were able to come up with several more things which fortified our petition. And in fact, it turned out that while doing research for this, it turned out that there were criminal cases for which the wife is also liable now. So first, we filed a petition for annulment. We sought damages also, not just from the wife, but also the parents of the wife, as well as the wife's lover in that same annulment petition, filed before the family court, because we said that when the wife married my client, knowing that she has an affair, and her parents also knowing, when we had proof of the fact that her parents also knew about her affair, despite knowing about her affair, the parents are still getting her married to my client. That means that they deliberately did something which they could foresee that is going to lead to a situation like this. And that is why they are all liable. So we sought not only annulment, we also saw damages from the wife, the wife's parents, as well as the wife's lover. Apart from that, we also filed that criminal complaint of whatever sections were made out against. When we came up with more evidence and we came up with more data, it turned out that there were offenses which were also committed. Of course, the matter is going on, so I won't comment on more of the exact situation, but as a broad this thing. And there are several such things. So another thing that I have done for a few people, I think in January, a man reached out to me and told me that he went out on a date once with a girl, and after that things didn't work out and they kind of split. A couple of weeks later, the girl messaged him and said that she needs 10,000 rupees urgently, and if he does not give her the 10,000 rupees, she will file a harassment case against him in the police and say that when we went out together, this man forcibly molested me. Now, she had called him up and said this, but she also left him a message after a few minutes saying, "Are you giving the 10,000 right now, or should I go to the police?" Now, the man called me up and asked me, "What should I do?" And he said that I'm fine giving the 10,000, but I would rather give the 10,000 to my lawyer rather than paying this woman, because once I pay her this 10,000 rupees, she will understand that she can extort this money from me again. And so I, the lawyer, drafted a legal notice to that girl. I sent it to her and I told him that after I send her this legal notice, you are supposed to block her from everywhere so that she cannot reach out to you. And even if she wants to go to the police now, we will have a record of the fact that she is trying to extort money from you. It is not, otherwise what would have happened is she goes and files the complaint, the police rush after him, he is arrested, or he has to now file anticipatory bail. So the thing gets much more bigger, and all the evidence that he wants to show will now not amount to much, because at the stage of anticipatory bail, the evidence which is there in possession of the boy in this situation will hold very, very less significance. And that is why a legal notice by a lawyer, first and foremost, would be a deterrent, because the woman knows that a lawyer is now involved. Things can be taken seriously. If it was an empty threat, she now knows that this man means business. Secondly, even if she would have gone to the police, a prior record, again, this is another example of a prior record. A prior record would again help my client get anticipatory bail and also ultimately be able to disprove the allegation during trial. Yeah. In fact, I forgot about the original question, but I think I've kind of talked about
defense about the defense. Yeah.
Yes.
Defense
So these are,
strategy.
yes. So these are a few of the defense strategies. Of course, everything is a case-to-case basis. In fact, just yesterday, a friend of mine who is in the judicial services, he called me up and he told me that he reminded me around 7 months prior that a dispute had happened between a husband and a wife, and I told him that you should file a divorce case and you should also, take all your remedies in law. And there are other remedies as well, which depends on a case-to-case basis. So he told me that these are the things which had happened, and I told him you should go to the court immediately and be at the forefront of things. And my friend told me that person did not pay heed. The friend's friend did not pay heed to this advice that we had given. And then the wife filed a 498A case. And after, when they went for mediation, the girl's mother filed a molestation case against the boy's father. And then after that, when they went again for another mediation process, some other person filed a 376 rape case against one of the other parties in the boy's side. So, things like these keep happening, and that is why being at the forefront is very, very important. But of course, it all depends from case to case basis. I'll just give a few examples of things which can be done. Of course, there is always, especially when you are falsely accused, there is something which I have always found, there's always something you can do when you are faced with false allegations or the threat of a false allegation. The faster you move, the more preemptively you move, the better your chances of success in a litigation case will be.
Thank you, Amishji. Even here, I think early beginners advantage is there.
Absolutely, Anand bhai.
Thank you, Amishji. We are really running out of time. It was a wonderful session, and a few people have also reached out for questions, and I am sure you can reach out to our special speaker, and he would be very happy to connect with you and address your queries.
Absolutely, I'm there on LinkedIn. Anand bhai can give my email address, whatever works.
Yes. Thank you, Amishji. And I would also like to remind you again, Amishji is also maintaining a YouTube channel where he almost constantly on everyday basis discusses laws which are very relevant, and in a simple and lucid English and Hindi. He talks about the similar cases and also about the cases which are very, very important or which are having relevance on a day-to-day basis. I request you all people to go and visit his page and also check on his videos.
Very kind of you, Anand bhai.
Thank you. So with this, we wrap today's session. We are on YouTube and Facebook. Subscribe to our channel, AP Legal Chambers, to be the first person to receive all our updates. And if you have any queries, also reach us on our Facebook or social media pages. And on behalf of my team, AP Legal Chambers, on my personal behalf, I thank our special speaker, Amishji, and also all our participants for attending this session. And it is Anand signing off. Have a great week. Thank you and have a nice day.